What's up, YouTube? We're here with our first video of the channel, which is pretty exciting. And this will be the beginning of a series that discusses tips, tricks, and productivity hacks for working with data. So if you are a data nerd like myself and want to be more effective and efficient in your workflow, then we will be putting out content that discusses exactly that. So my name is Brandon Crossley. I'm the CEO of Gridabl, which is a spreadsheet software specifically designed to make it easier to work with data. But today we are talking about Google Sheets. And in particular, we're discussing how to create custom functions in Google Sheets. And you might be sitting there wondering, why would I want to create custom functions? Which is a fair question. And in order for me to answer that, I think it might first help to take a step back and describe what built-in functions are in the first place. So Google Sheets in particular offers about 400 to 500 built-in functions that make it easier to do common or repetitive tasks so that you don't need to type them out manually each time. And we can access these functions by inserting in any cell an equal sign and then typing the name of a function we'd like to use. And there are so many of these functions that we can really type in almost any letter, and there's going to be functions associated with it. So if you're just ever curious, you can kind of search through them. But right now, let's say we want to sum multiple cells together for a total of those cells. We can type in sum or begin to type in sum. We'll get some recommendations in the dropdown, and with each one you hover over, there's a little description that will tell you about what the function is. But if I click on the option I'm looking for, sum, then it'll autocomplete that function for us with the first parentheses already inserted. And I can click on this little question mark over on the left-hand side here, and that will pop up some information or more detail about the function, how to use it, an example, for instance, what it returns, what it takes in as far as its arguments. And so we get the full detail about whether this is actually the right function we want to use. So this list of functions, this built-in functions, is what exactly we're going to be adding onto. This is really relevant in situations where you might be using complex logic over and over again in your spreadsheet, and you want to kind of centralize that logic so you manage it in one place. And if you update it once, then it updates your entire spreadsheet. Because if you have, let's say, a function that looks something like this, where you have some long convoluted statement with multiple nested functions and conditions and variables, this might be something that you would want to put into a custom function if you're reusing this everywhere in your spreadsheet, because I don't know what the hell this is doing just by looking at it. And that's a problem, because the whole point of these spreadsheets is to make our analysis pretty clear and straightforward. And with something like this, that is certainly not the case. So these are the exact type of situations where you might want to use custom functions just to clean things up and make it a little more clear about what you're doing. So we have some example data already inserted here, and it's just a list of random food items that I came up with, because that's what you do. And I have ratings for these foods, so I have 1, 2, and 3, and 1 being a low score, 3 being a high score, and that just means I like broccoli a little bit less than I like tacos, which I think is probably pretty common. But this will be the data that we're working with. And we want a custom function that is going to return an emoji representation of both the food and the score that we give the food, because I don't like reading, so I want an emoji to show me what the rating in the food is, so I don't have to read anything. And this is going to be our starting point for creating our custom function. So with that being said, we'll just dive right in. This video is brought to you by Gridabl, a smarter spreadsheet for working with data. Head over to gridabl.com to learn more and sign up for our beta release today. The first thing we're going to want to do is go to extensions up in our navbar here, and then click on app scripts. And when we do that, it's going to take us to a new tab where we open up the editor for creating our custom function. There's only a couple things that you really need to know about the editor. So on the left-hand side, you can see that we have files here, and right now we're inside the file code.gs. And this is just the standard file that when you first open up app scripts, that is going to be populated in your files directory. And we can change this name to whatever we'd like, so we don't have to keep it as code.gs. We will have to leave the .gs though, because that is the file type. And what that relates to is Google Scripts, I believe. I'll have to double check that. But Google Scripts is really a sort of a flavor of JavaScript. So ultimately what we'll be writing here to define our custom function is JavaScript. And most valid JavaScript will be valid for Google Scripts as far as my understanding of it. There are some exceptions, of course, with some of the newer syntax of JavaScript, but just be aware that if you're ever looking for how to do something within your custom function, you can pretty much just do a Google search on how to do it in JavaScript, and it'll relate directly to what you're doing in Google Scripts here. So on the right-hand side, we have the editor, which is where we define our custom function. And right now it gives us just a standard kind of template, if you will, for defining the function with nothing inside of it. So right now this is just kind of a blank function. It's called my function here. So the first thing we're going to do is change the name of this. So since we want to return emojis for a particular food and rating, we're just going to call this Emojify. And one other thing to point out here about the syntax is that right now we're using all caps for the function name, and that is simply because of the standard practice within spreadsheets. Most or all spreadsheet functions have all caps as far as how the naming of the function is defined. So we're going to use that here. Just know that if you're searching online for JavaScript examples, you will not see this all caps. That is not a standard JavaScript thing. You're going to likely see what is, I think they use camel case for JavaScript. So just be aware that this is non-standard practice for JavaScript, but since we're using this for a spreadsheet, we will make it all caps. And then within the parentheses here, this is where we decide what this function takes in, what we're going to feed this function so that we can work with whatever data we're sending it. And for this particular example, we have a food, and then we have a rating that we're going to be working with. And so based on the food and the rating, we're going to return some emojis. So this is kind of the basic standard function definition, often called the function signature. And then within these curly braces here, that's where we're going to define what our function will do. So this kind of defines the beginning and the end of the function itself. You're going to see these curly braces many times because it is a standard way to scope what will happen under certain conditions, or really within any part of the function itself. And with that being said, we'll start off by defining our first element, or our first variable within the function. So we're going to say var result is going to be an empty string. And so the reason I'm doing this first is because JavaScript evaluates top down. So it's going to read things in first at the top and then move its way down through the function. And by initializing a result variable, this is going to be the thing that we ultimately want to show in our Google Sheet. So right now it's an empty string, but I want to work with this variable later in the function, and you're going to see that shortly. But variables are just little sort of placeholders that we can store data to work with it later within the function. And now what we can do is start to work with the food parameter that is part of our function signature. And we'll start by defining an if statement, and we'll say that if food is equal to corn, which is one of our options in the example data that I provided, we are going to put some curly braces to scope this condition so that if the food that is passed in is corn, we're going to do something, and if it is not corn, we are going to pass over this essentially. So I'm going to try and keep the syntax here also as basic as possible. So if you are familiar with the built-in functions in spreadsheets, like the if statement, for instance, or the if function, that you're going to know how to kind of use this logic in a similar fashion. This is going to lead me to writing a pretty ugly function, so please don't judge the quality of the code, or do. It's up to you. But I'm going to try and keep this like by introducing the least amount of concepts possible. So if the food is corn, then we want to do something here. And this is where we're going to finally use this variable we created, which is result. And so we can say that result is going to equal the current value of result, which right now is an empty string. And then we're going to add our emoji to it. So let's go ahead and bring up the emoji menu. And if it's corn, we want some corn. So let's go ahead and search for that. There we go. And then that's all we want to do. So if it's corn, we just want to add corn emoji to our result. So right now, if the food we passed in was corn, then the value of result would be this corn emoji. So that's pretty much what we're trying to do here. Since again JavaScript evaluates top down, if I was to do something like this and put the result down here, by the time that we're evaluating whether the food is corn or not, and we reference result, this doesn't yet exist because this comes before the result has been defined. And so in order to work with the result, we need it to be defined before we start to reference it. So that's a little bit about why we did it that way. And so now we can just do the other foods, just the same fashion, in the same fashion. So let's go ahead and add those. And then let's add one more since we have 3 foods. Okay, and so now we have corn, I think it was broccoli, yeah, no. And then we have tacos. And then now what we just do is replace the emoji for each of these. So for broccoli, we have broccoli. For corn, we have corn, or for tacos rather. So we have tacos. Okay, so now what we have is something that is pretty similar to what we see in Google Sheets. So if I create a comment here, which just means that this is not going to be evaluated by the function. So if we have that if statement in Google Sheets, we have that standard definition where the first thing that we put in is like some condition. So if 3 is greater than 1, then give me true, otherwise give me false. Okay, and so this is kind of we can think of this as the same thing as what we're doing right now. So we have this if, which would relate to the name of the function that we have here, and then we have this condition, which right now we have 3 conditions in here. So you can already see how we can build more complex functions that actually read a lot better than if we had multiple conditions within this if statement or this if function, because then we'd have to do a bunch of nesting if we had more than 2 return values, for instance. So, and then we have the true and the false, and what that relates to is what we're going to see in Google Sheets. So the way we do that in JavaScript is we simply say return result. And so instead of potentially returning 2 different values, we simply have one reference to the result variable that we've created up here at the top. And by the time we get down here to this part of the function, we will have already gone through each of these 3 options for the food, and one of these emojis will have been added to this result here. So this should return in one of the emojis that represents the food. So if I go back over here, if I save this, and then I can go back over here, and we should have something already operational for this function. So if I type in emojify, and then I put in corn and our rating, we should, yep, there we go. We got our emojis. And so now we can use this function, and we are getting back the return value that we would expect. So that's all fine and good. And hopefully that provides a little bit of a comparison about how we use the if function in Google Sheets and kind of how we are translating it here to JavaScript. So the next thing I'm going to show you is how to handle the rating, which we're going to do in the same way, but I'm going to switch up the syntax a little bit just to make it a little more common as far as the use, because we're not going to see oftentimes in the wild 3 if statements that just basically you pass over them if it's not a condition that is met. So what we're going to do is we're going to say if the rating is equal to 1, and one thing I should also point out here, so the reason we wrap the emojis in these quotations is because this is basically text. Emojis are basically text that the computer will read and then return like an image, essentially. So what we're working with in JavaScript, just to keep things simple, is mostly text and numbers. So if it's not a number, you can pretty much assume it's going to be text. There's obviously cases where that's not true. So dates and times, for instance, there's actually a date time object. So if you're working with dates and times, things get a little more complicated. But as a general rule, it's pretty safe to say that if you have a number, you can use a standard number because JavaScript understands it. Otherwise, it's probably going to be text, and so we need to wrap it in these double quotations or single quotations. So that's one thing to point out. So if the rating is 1, then we want to add on to result. We want to say that result is equal to, well, actually, let's introduce a new form of how to define this. So we're going to say result is plus equal to some new emoji. And for a rating of 1, that's a low rating. So let's say it's equal to this circle with a slash through it because we're not interested in that food. And so this statement here is equivalent to doing result equals result plus something. So we're taking whatever the current value of result is and we're just adding something onto it. So this is saying the exact same thing. This is just a shorthand way of putting that same statement. And that's because we don't want to type result twice because in programming we have this concept called dry, which is don't repeat yourself, and this would be, I think, a microcosm of that. So we don't want to repeat having result in there twice if we can just type it once and have things be a little bit more clean. So we can actually do that for each of these. I'm not going to at this point, but just keep that in mind that there's a couple of different ways to define the statement for the result is now equal to what its current value is, and then adding something onto it. Next we can do else if rating is equal to 2, curly braces, and then again this is scoping what's going to happen if it's equal to 2, and then we can say that result is equal to some other emoji. So we'll go ahead and let's say the OK sign. So if it's a 2, it's fine, right? And then so now all we have is our last rating. So we can do else. Actually, we can do else by itself, and what this will do is it'll allow us to say if these first two conditions are not met, then do this no matter what. But in our scenario, that won't make total sense because we only want ratings to be equal to 3 in this scenario, because we don't want it to return a great food for anything that's not a 1 or a 2. Because what if it's a 0 or something is passed in that is not supposed to be passed in? So we'll say rating is a 3, and then for that we'll say result is we're going to add on to result the emoji of the heart. Okay, and so now this is a little bit more clear and concise, that this is a single expression. So if a condition's not met, then we have another condition that may be met. Right now, with 3 floating if statements, essentially, these kind of like are on their own, and again, not common practice. You're usually going to see something more along the lines of this, or even something more sophisticated that I'm not coming up with right now. But with that being said, so now what we're doing is, again, we're coming, every time we call this function, we're passing in some food, we're passing in a rating, that we create this variable so that we can reference it later. We're checking if it's corn, checking if it's broccoli, checking if it's tacos, and then we're adding these emojis onto it if it meets any of those conditions. So let's say it's corn, there will be a corn in here, and then if when we come down to the rating, we look at whether it's a 1, 2, or 3. And if it's either of those 3 ratings, then we're adding the appropriate emoji onto the end of it. So we're going to see like a corn and an OK symbol, for instance. And that's pretty much all we're doing because we're reading it again from top to bottom. So that's all we really need. We can click save on that, and now our function should be operating exactly how we would expect it to be. So we have the exact emojis we wanted, and it visually represents what we want it to represent. And so far, it seems like we're done. But there is one small thing that I wanted to point out before I close off this video, and that is, if you notice, we type in sum and we get a list of drop-down options, so things that are related to sum, for instance. But if we type in Emojify, we see that there's, even if we do all caps, there's no option to select from in the drop-down, and that is kind of a problem because if we have a bunch of functions, we want to be able to access them and understand the documentation for them. And so we need to do one extra step in order for that to happen. So if we go back to our function here, we need to insert a multi-line comment. And so comments are typically used to document what's happening, like for instance, what a function does, or what it takes in, or what a particular part of the function does. Usually they're documentation for clarification purposes. For this, though, for Google or App Scripts, rather, they have a special feature that allows us to define a comment that will populate the dropdown so that we have information about the function itself. So if I type in a multi-line comment here, which I'm pressing Command /, and actually that's not even correct. So the syntax for this is /*, and then it'll auto-complete for us. We can press enter to go down to the next level. And the first thing that they expect for this documentation is a description of the function. And so for this, we'll say that it returns an emoji representation of a food and rating. Okay, so that'll be the description that shows up in our dialog box. And then next, we need to define the parameters that the function takes in and provide some detail about what those are. So the way we do that is we have a keyword here with the @ sign and then param, and that tells us that we're now referencing one of the things that we are passing into the function. And then we, in curly braces, provide an example of what this parameter is. So let's say it's corn again. So this will be an example of what you can use as a value for that first parameter. And then we make sure that we reference the name of that parameter so that the engine behind this, whatever is compiling all this information, can map this corn value to the food. So we type in food so that they match, and then we can type in a description of what the food is. So food to rate. And then next we will do the same thing for our second parameter, which is the rating. And so that'll take in a number, let's say 3, and this will be rating. And then our description for the rating is rating for the food item or something like that. And then next we will say what this returns, what this function returns. And so we'll say @return, and then it will be a the emoji representation, the emojis. We'll say that. How about that? And then last but not least, in order for Google to know to add this to the drop-down list, we will put in another keyword here, @custom function. And then with all of that being done, we should now see all the information related to this function in the dropdown, and it should be one of the functions that Google suggests to us as we type it in. So let's go ahead and make sure that's the case. So we'll type in @emojify, and then there we go. So we have now the option in the dropdown. We can click on it. It'll autocomplete for us. It'll show us the food and the rating as the parameters or the arguments that it takes. We get the example here automatically built for us based on what we described in the comment, and then all of the information about the description and which parameters, the descriptions for the parameters, things like that. So now we have a fully functioning built-in function that we've extended to our own customized needs. So I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, please smash that like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.